Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in the Knowledge Translation webinar series presented by the Knowledge Translation Platform of the Alberta SPOR Support Unit. Glad to welcome you all today. So I'll just start by saying if you at any time have questions or can't hear anything, please use the chat window at the bottom of your screen to let us know that, and we'll address some questions as we go and some questions at the end. So welcome again. My name is Denise Thomson. I'm the Associate Director of the Knowledge Translation Platform of Alberta SPOR. And with me today are Dr. Lisa Hartling and Michelle Foisy. And the topic of today's webinar is knowledge synthesis as a knowledge translation tool. So this is a question that comes up periodically around the role of knowledge synthesis in the KT continuum. Okay. So the function of the Alberta SPOR Support Unit is to provide support for Alberta's healthcare researchers, and the Alberta SPOR is in the form of 7 platforms, of which the Knowledge Translation Platform obviously is one, and our areas of support are knowledge synthesis, knowledge translation, and implementation science. And providing these training opportunities such as these webinars is part of our remit. So today's presenters, first of all, is Dr. Lisa Hartling, who's an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the U of A, and also one of the 2 leads of the Knowledge Translation Platform, along with Dr. Sumit Majumdar, also in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry here at the U of A. And she has extensive experience in all sorts of knowledge synthesis projects, such as systematic reviews, overviews of reviews, and so on, and is very active in the Cochrane collaboration. I'll also be making a brief appearance myself. I've already introduced myself. I work with the KT platform, and I also have a lot of connections with the Cochrane collaboration. And then lastly, Michelle Foisy will be speaking. She's a PhD student of Dr. Hartling's and has done a lot of work in overviews of reviews and other types of knowledge synthesis. So she'll be discussing overviews primarily, which is the focus of her current work. All right, so over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Denise, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start off our session today just by talking, giving a high-level discussion of different review methods. So this slide shows a number of different review types and nomenclature that we might see in the knowledge synthesis field. There is some overlap across these different review types. But it's just to give a snapshot that there is lots emerging under the umbrella of knowledge synthesis. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 to 15 minutes is to define knowledge synthesis, to talk about some of the general steps involved in knowledge synthesis, and then I'm going to touch on a few different review types that I'm most familiar with, those being systematic reviews, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, and then I'll just touch a bit on qualitative and mixed methods reviews, and then wrap up and pass you on to Denise and Michelle. So knowledge synthesis, it's a scientific approach to identifying and summarizing evidence. Knowledge synthesis should be reproducible and transparent, and I think these 2 points really highlight the distinction between knowledge synthesis reviews and traditional reviews that we may have seen in the literature a number of years ago and continue to see to some extent. Knowledge syntheses should use mechanisms to minimize bias and optimize validity. And knowledge syntheses can use both quantitative or qualitative methods. Knowledge syntheses can also synthesize evidence that's either quantitative or qualitative in nature. So in terms of how knowledge synthesis fits into knowledge translation, The purpose of knowledge synthesis is to identify key messages from a body of evidence in a research field. If the evidence is strong, we might then move that evidence into knowledge translation tools or other knowledge translation initiatives to ensure that that best evidence is taken up in clinical practice. If the evidence isn't strong, or if there are gaps in the evidence, the knowledge synthesis activities are really useful to help inform the design and conduct of new research. So there's several key general steps involved in all knowledge synthesis activities. One is to specify the objectives and to formulate clear questions. Often we'll use, in the context of systematic reviews, the mnemonic, the PICO mnemonic to formulate our questions in terms of clearly identifying our population, interventions of interest, comparisons, and outcomes. But I think for all knowledge synthesis activities, it's very important to clearly specify the objectives and what you intend to achieve through the synthesis effort. It's important to define inclusion and exclusion criteria and to define the methods and prepare a protocol up front. And that helps to ensure that the methods followed are rigorous and developed a priori and not influenced by the nature of the literature or the results that one uncovers in the synthesis process. The general steps involved in knowledge synthesis are to identify potentially eligible studies or studies relevant to your objectives and your research questions. I've put all in brackets there because that varies depending on the nature of the knowledge synthesis product. So with systematic reviews, where we're trying to identify the effect or estimate the effect of an intervention, it's really key to identify all relevant studies. In a scoping review, that won't be necessarily the case, where we're trying to just get maybe more of a general idea of a body of evidence. In all knowledge synthesis, it's important to apply inclusion and exclusion criteria. All knowledge syntheses will extract data from the included studies to some extent, but the extent of data and the type of data extracted will vary by knowledge synthesis product. Some knowledge synthesis products will assess the methodological quality or risk of bias of the included studies, and this is particularly pertinent to systematic reviews. And all knowledge synthesis products will analyze the data using appropriate means. And again, the means that are used to synthesize or analyze the data may vary depending on the objective and the knowledge synthesis product. Some knowledge syntheses, in particular systematic reviews, will assess the quality of the body of evidence, for example, using the grade approach. And knowledge synthesis products should prepare a structured, transparent report so that the reader has a clear idea of what the objective was, what methods were used, and any changes that were made to the methods along the way. So systematic reviews are one form of knowledge synthesis. They're the most common approach in healthcare that have been used over the last 20 years for answering what works in terms of knowledge synthesis approaches. So one definition of a systematic review taken from Cochrane is a review of a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant research, to collect and analyze the data from the studies that are included in the review, and to report the results. So systematic reviews can be used to answer a variety of questions. For example, they can be used to answer questions around the benefit and harms of a treatment in animal models, a treatment in humans, a new service delivery model, or a quality improvement initiative. We can also use systematic reviews to answer the question about accuracy of diagnostic tests. We can ask about the experiences of patients undergoing a certain treatment, or what the prevalence of a condition is. We can also use systematic review methods to answer how strong is the association between different factors, or a factor and a disease, or an exposure and a health outcome. Systematic reviews may use a variety of different methods for analysis. So meta-analysis is a common way of statistically combining data in a systematic review. Sometimes the term meta-analysis is used synonymously with systematic review, but really it represents the statistical approach to analysis in the context of a systematic review. So we're able to statistically compare, for example, one intervention against another. Network meta-analysis has emerged over the last number of years as a statistical method that includes both direct and indirect evidence. And this is particularly valuable if we want to look at comparative effectiveness, in particular if we're interested in comparing one intervention to another intervention that hasn't necessarily been compared in direct head-to-head trials. And then systematic reviews may use a narrative or qualitative approach to analysis if it's not meaningful to do a statistical analysis, or if the nature of the data just doesn't lead to doing statistical approach. So with a narrative analysis, one might organize the studies into logical categories depending on the objective and the focus of the review, look at the analyses within the studies, and then do some cross-study syntheses. So there's lots of excellent guidance on how to conduct a systematic review. The Cochrane Handbook is a fantastic resource. It's available online. It's updated regularly, and there's many experts internationally that contribute to the content of the handbook. So it's a great resource if you want to get some general information on how to go about conducting a systematic review. Cochrane put out a few years ago expectations for Cochrane intervention reviews, so that's abbreviated as MESSIER. Also a good framework in terms of knowing what's expected in a systematic review if you're conducting one, or if you happen to be reading one and using one for knowledge translation strategy. The Institute of Medicine in the US also put out guidance or expectations in terms of standards for systematic reviews, and it's another good resource to follow if you're conducting a systematic review or if you're using a systematic review for a KT strategy. Prospero is an international prospective register of systematic reviews. So the idea there is to have a single register where individuals can sign up if they are conducting a systematic review. So one can go there to see if a systematic review is being conducted on a topic of interest. It facilitates collaboration as well as potentially avoiding duplication of effort. And there are reporting guidelines for systematic reviews. PRISMA is the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, so more of a focus on systematic reviews that have a quantitative data and analysis. MOOSE is the meta-analysis of observational studies in epidemiology, and both these, as well as a number of reporting guidelines, are available on the Equator Network. So that's a really excellent resource to go to in terms of looking at how studies of various designs should be reported. So moving to scoping reviews, the general objectives of a scoping review are to map key concepts in a research area, or to map the main sources and types of evidence available. So often they'll be used as a preliminary to full syntheses in order to determine feasibility, to see if there's enough studies in a certain area to warrant a full systematic review, and to identify maybe different topics within a broad area that are amenable to systematic reviews. So because they're more of a mapping exercise, often the scope is broader than the questions you would see in a systematic review. Some of the ways that scoping review methods differ from systematic reviews is that often there is no assessment of methodological quality of the primary research. One might map the types of evidence available in terms of study designs, or whether it's quantitative or qualitative, but often not that assessment of methodological quality as we would see in a systematic review. Often there's no detailed synthesis of the results of the relevant studies. So often the intent and the objective of a scoping review is quite different. So we might not necessarily be looking at what the effect estimate of an intervention might be, but we might be looking across a body of literature to see what types of outcomes have been evaluated in effectiveness studies. And then that would be our results of the scoping review. In general, scoping reviews provide an analytic framework or thematic construction in order to present a narrative account of the existing literature. So in terms of rapid reviews, the intent of rapid reviews is to synthesize available evidence, but they're often done rapidly in order to meet the time constraints and needs of specific healthcare decision makers. And because they're done often under time constraints, then we see that in conducting rapid reviews, the reviewers tend to streamline traditional systematic review methods. However, the approaches to increase efficiency are not consistent across rapid review products, so they vary across the product and across depending on the time frame available to meet the end user needs. I was involved in leading a project over the last 2 years looking at rapid reviews, and in what we did, we found that the methods and products are tremendously variable across this construct of rapid reviews. We examined very closely 36 examples of rapid review products from 20 organizations, and we found that production time ranged from 5 minutes to 8 months. And the methods to reduce the production time were not consistent across the products. We found that there was a different approach to question development and review production within rapid reviews, and it was very much driven by and reliant on the relationship with the specific end user and focused on their specific needs and the decision that they needed to make. And therefore, sometimes the methods chosen were dependent on their timeline and the decisions that they needed to make in a short period of time and the context they were working within. We found that it was useful to categorize rapid review products not only by production time, but by extent of synthesis. And so we came up with these different categories: evidence inventory, rapid response, rapid review, and really how they differ is the extent of synthesis offered, where evidence inventories often just list what's available in the literature, whereas a rapid review would conduct a more formal synthesis, but it may be more contained than we would see in a systematic review in terms of the number of outcomes or the breadth of topic coverage. There are also systematic reviews of qualitative studies, and we're seeing these emerging more in the context of Cochrane reviews. There's also a chapter in the Cochrane Handbook on systematic reviews of qualitative research. Some of the considerations here is that there may be different methods employed in identifying qualitative research as compared to quantitative research, which has been the more traditional focus of systematic reviews, or certainly systematic reviews within Cochrane. The goal of searching and the approach to searching may be slightly different, whereas in a systematic review of quantitative research it's more linear. With qualitative research it may be more iterative and using snowballing techniques. Assessing methodological quality is still important, but there'll be very different tools used compared to if we're including primary research that is focused on quantitative methods. There's numerous approaches to analysis and synthesis within systematic reviews of qualitative studies, and these are really driven by qualitative research methodology with an emphasis on generating new conceptual understandings and theoretical explanations. So there's also mixed methods reviews are starting to emerge or have started to emerge over some time, where we include both quantitative and qualitative evidence. The purpose of combining both types of evidence may be to inform reviews. So qualitative research might help define and refine the review question, to enhance reviews, to complement the evidence of effectiveness, to extend reviews, so address questions related to effectiveness but not about specific effect estimates themselves, or to supplement reviews, so addressing aspects other than effectiveness. Realist reviews are one example of a mixed methods review. So while systematic reviews really get at the question of what works, realist reviews might be more focused on mechanisms of action and answer questions about what works for whom, in what circumstances, in what respects, and how. So just in summary, so the field of knowledge synthesis is extensive and expansive, and I've only touched on given a very high-level overview of a few different approaches to knowledge synthesis. I think fundamental to knowledge syntheses and any knowledge synthesis product is that it's rigorous and transparent in its methods. There are several key approaches that I've talked about today, so systematic reviews are really helpful for answering the question of what works. Mixed methods reviews might be more appropriate to answer the who, why, where, when, and how. of effectiveness or interventions. Scoping reviews, often more broad, really looking at what's out there. And then rapid reviews, really focusing on what works for a specific end user or in a specific context. And CIHR talks about knowledge syntheses as being the cornerstone of knowledge translation. And I think it's really essential that in any knowledge translation effort that we're basing that on best available evidence. And knowledge synthesis provides a tool for us to synthesize and evaluate the best available evidence. I have some references that I've noted, and I believe these slides will be available to the audience after the presentation. So thank you, and I'm going to pass you over to Denise now to talk a bit more about the Cochrane collaboration.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. And I'll just remind you, if you do have questions as we go, you do have the chat box at the bottom. And just let us know as questions come up or you want to raise any points. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the Cochrane collaboration. So my objectives in this talk, just to briefly talk about terminology, and then review the history and purpose of Cochrane, which more formally known as the Cochrane collaboration, and talk a bit about the Cochrane collaboration's main output, the Cochrane Library. So just a very quick bit about terminology. The reason that we wanted to include a bit specifically about Cochrane in this talk is that when people are discussing knowledge synthesis and specifically systematic reviews, you'll often hear references to the Cochrane Handbook, or this systematic review was done according to Cochrane standards, or have you checked Cochrane to see if there's a systematic review on that already? And so just so that you'll come away from this talk with a clear understanding of why the word Cochrane comes up so often when people are talking about knowledge synthesis endeavors. So the history of Cochrane, it was established just over 20 years ago, and it was named after Archie Cochrane, a British epidemiologist who made a really influential call in the late 80s, early 90s about the amount of time it was taking to change practice. And one of the points that he made very forcefully and with great resonance was the waste of effort involved in having multiple studies on a question, and wouldn't it be much more powerful to bring all those studies together? So both doing high quality trials, so he advocated for the use of randomized control trials, which are considered the gold standard, but then also synthesizing them afterwards and using those syntheses as a means of informing healthcare practice. So Cochrane was founded, the Cochrane collaboration was founded and named after him since he had been so influential. And so you see right from the outset of Cochrane, there's been a strong knowledge translation focus. The point of all these systematic reviews that Cochrane produces is to inform healthcare practice and policy. So the output of Cochrane is the Cochrane Library, which houses the systematic reviews that are produced by a mix of paid staff and volunteers. So when we talk about Cochrane or the Cochrane collaboration, we're talking about a network, an international network that numbers about 35,000 people. And what unites them is this commitment to improving healthcare practice and policy by producing these systematic reviews and by disseminating them, getting the findings of the reviews put into practice. So it really is an impressive group. And so there's a small number of paid staff, but they're tremendously outnumbered by volunteers who give their time for producing the reviews. And so not only do these volunteers prepare the reviews, but an important thing about Cochrane is that we put a great emphasis on regularly updating those reviews as well, so that if you go to a Cochrane review, at least ideally, it's been produced quite recently and therefore incorporates the most recent evidence. So that's a little tricky to maintain in practice, but it is our ideal. Another place where Cochrane is very active is identifying randomized trials worldwide and making them available on a database that forms part of the Cochrane Library called Central. We do a lot of training. Obviously, maintaining that network of volunteers, you have to be bringing in new people and skilling up the people you have, so training is a key part of that. And we do a lot of promoting the accessibility of Cochrane Reviews by doing a lot of knowledge translation work as well. So this is a fun illustration of Cochrane's structure. Cochrane is formed on the basis of about just over 50 review groups. So each review group has a specific area of care. I don't know how well you can see this graphic. The large pink bubble in the bottom left-hand quadrant of the slide is the pregnancy and childbirth group. And so they're big because they have a lot of reviews. A big proportion of Cochrane reviews go to their group. And then you'll see other groups that have been also represented by proportion of topics, by the proportion that their topic forms of Cochrane reviews overall, and some loose groupings have been made. So just this is an interesting way of looking at Cochrane's structure, but what you can see there is the tremendous diversity in healthcare issues that Cochrane reviews will address. So I alluded earlier to, and Lisa also mentioned the Cochrane Handbook, and I alluded earlier to the idea that Cochrane reviews are of a high standard, or that the standards for Cochrane reviews are seen as something to aspire to. That's really one of the great strengths of Cochrane collaboration reviews, is that they're done to a very high standard, following a rigorous methodology, which is laid out in great detail in the Cochrane Handbook. Again, they're produced, as you gather from the name Cochrane Collaboration, they're produced by a collaborative effort. Each review is produced by a multi-author team, often working at distance from each other, and their collaboration is enabled technologically. A lot of work is done online. As I mentioned earlier, it's international in scope, bringing people in from all over the world. We are also a pioneer in including patients or consumers in the production and review, peer review of systematic reviews. That's been a facet of Cochrane's work right from the beginning. And we are very careful about our funding sources, and very rigorous in that approach as well, to avoid the perception of bias, because industry funding can be a source of bias in both trials and systematic reviews. So I mentioned the Cochrane Library. It's an online journal. That's where the systematic reviews are published. You will find it at cochranelibrary.com. It's considered the single best source for reliable information on the effects of healthcare interventions, and it's made up of several databases. The Cochrane database of systematic reviews is the most widely known of those, and often when people say, you know, oh, go to Cochrane or check Cochrane or see what Cochrane has to say on this, that's what they mean is the database of systematic reviews. But there are others as well, including the Central Register of Controlled Trials called Central, which I mentioned earlier. So it has as you would expect from a well-respected resource, it has a high impact factor, both year on year and over the 5 years, and because of that is considered one of the top 10 medical journals in the world. So to have a review published on the Cochrane Library is quite an accomplishment. So there's its current look and the link that you can go to. So in some countries in the world there is a national license so that Cochrane reviews are available without charge to the end user because the government has paid for a national license. We don't have one in Canada, although some individual provinces do. However, if you're affiliated with a university, you can often get to it through your university library. And the abstracts are available anywhere in the world, even without a subscription. So you'll see in this growth, in this chart, I mean, even if you can't see the individual years at the bottom, a tremendous growth in the Cochrane Reviews and protocols that are published in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, as well as the entries in Central. One good aspect of Cochrane is that the protocols for reviews are also peer-reviewed and published, so that you can see, even if a review is underway and the full results aren't available yet, you can see the protocol online, and that's part of the rigor of the methods that both the protocol and the finished product are peer-reviewed. So there are some places where you would search the Cochrane Library and some other aspects where it wouldn't be as helpful to you, these are some of the questions that you would go to the Cochrane Library for. So what is the effective treatment of a certain condition? How do you effectively use a certain intervention in a certain condition? Comparing treatment Y to treatment Z. More recently, Cochrane has also started to include some diagnostic test accuracy reviews, so you can start to check it for reviews on the accuracy of certain diagnostic tests. However, the Cochrane Library does not include general healthcare information. So if you need information on prognosis, etiology, or epidemiology of a certain condition, you would go elsewhere. Similarly, incidence and prevalence of conditions, information about mechanism of action of certain drugs or technologies or needs assessment studies. That kind of information is not on Cochrane, so you need to round out the systematic reviews with information from other sources. There is online training every month by our publisher, Wiley, on how to search the Cochrane Library, and these can be really helpful for you. So I've put the link there. If you click on that link, and the link will be active in the slides that are sent out to you afterwards, you can sign up for a free session on searching that, and those are run, as I've said, every month. Okay, so that's the end of my session. My email address is there if you'd like to follow up with me at any point. And now I'll hand things over to Michelle.
Thanks, Denise. So my name is Michelle, and I'm going to build off of what Lisa was talking about in her first presentation, where she described a number of knowledge synthesis methodologies. And I'm also going to build off of what Denise was just talking about in terms of using these methodologies in the context of the Cochrane collaboration. So I'm going to be talking today about a knowledge synthesis methodology called overviews of reviews. And these overviews were originally called umbrella reviews when they were first created. And that's because the aim or the purpose of an overview is to really capture a broad snapshot of all existing systematic review evidence on a clinical question of interest. So this can be a little bit confusing because overviews actually are referred to in many different ways in the literature. So some individuals call them, for example, systematic reviews of systematic reviews or overviews of systematic reviews. There are many different names to go by, but for our purposes today, we're going to call them overviews, and this is the preferred terminology of the Cochrane collaboration as well. So to give a specific definition of overviews, Overviews are designed to compile information from multiple systematic reviews to provide a comprehensive synthesis of this systematic review evidence. And as Lisa was saying, similar to systematic reviews, when we're conducting an overview, we want to use explicit, systematic, and reproducible methods to identify, select, and critically appraise all of the systematic reviews that are relevant to our clinical question. And we also want to have very specific methods of collecting and analyzing outcome data from these systematic reviews. So overviews are really designed to be accessible and user-friendly documents, and they can serve as a friendly front end for clinical and policy decision makers in that they combine a large amount of data on a clinical question. It may be helpful to also consider overviews in terms of looking at what they are not. So overviews do not aim to repeat or update the searches of the systematic reviews that are included in the overviews. The purpose of an overview is not to conduct a new systematic review within an overview, and the purpose is also not to search for any primary studies that might not be included in any systematic reviews. So really, the defining feature of an overview is that the unit of searching, inclusion, and data analysis is the systematic review itself. The Cochrane collaboration currently recognizes 4 different types of overviews. Overviews can look at different interventions for the same condition. They can look at different outcomes for the same intervention or condition. They can look at the same intervention across multiple different conditions, or they may also look at adverse effects of multiple interventions or conditions. And I have highlighted the first one, looking at different interventions for the same condition, because this is primarily the type of overview that you will find if you go to the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, and it's primarily the type of overview that I'm going to be talking about today. You can also classify overviews in terms of their purpose. So one purpose of overviews might be to present and describe the current body of systematic review evidence on a topic. So this would allow readers to discover the presence of a related group of systematic reviews and to see how much research has been conducted on that topic. Alternatively, another purpose of overviews might be to address a new or a different clinical question than the clinical questions that were asked in the included systematic reviews. So what I mean by that is that often this purpose of overviews aims to ask a question that is a subset of the questions that are posed in the included systematic reviews. So for example, an overview might be interested in looking at treatments for children only instead of the general population. Or they might be interested in looking at a subgroup of interventions. So for example, inhaled treatments only and not intravenous treatments for a certain condition. So this is a screenshot of the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, which you can access online. The first overview was actually published in the CDSR back in 2009, and now there are quite a number of overviews published on the Cochrane Library. And if you look to the top left of this screen, you'll see a little overviews tag in orange. It's labeled OV. So when you go onto the Cochrane Library, anything that you see with it as being labeled with this overviews tag can clearly indicate that this is an overview. Another venue where many overviews have been published is in the Cochrane Child Health Field. Dr. Hartling and Denise Thomson are co-directors of the Child Health Field, and for a number of years, for almost 10 years, the Child Health Field had a remit to publish overviews in a journal called Evidence-Based Child Health, the Cochrane Review Journal. The aim of this journal was to highlight timely and topical evidence related to infants, children, and youth, and we published an overview in almost every edition of this journal that was published, and we've published almost 30 overviews to date. So just to give you a sense of the type of questions that might be addressed by overviews, this is a summary of all the overviews that you can find in evidence-based child health. And as you'll see, there's a lot of questions related to the prevention and to the treatment of different disorders. So we're looking at multiple interventions for a specific disorder. So I'm going to spend the remainder of this talk describing how the child health field has conducted overviews. In very general terms, I think this would be useful for those of you who might have some interest in conducting an overview, but also for those of you who might come across overviews in your readings. This could be a valuable guide in order to be able to critically appraise those overviews that you do come across. So overviews follow the same general steps as systematic reviews, which Lisa went into detail about, but there are some differences. So I'm going to walk through each of these steps and elaborate a little bit. So before you even begin your overview, it's really important to make sure that your topic is clinically relevant. You want to assemble a complete author team, and this is the same as for systematic reviews. You want all of the same key players, so a project coordinator, an information specialist if you need help with your search, methodologists or research assistants, statisticians for help with analyses, and clinical leads to really provide that content expertise. And as with any large project, it's important to establish a realistic time frame. You also want to make sure that your systematic reviews that you'll be including in your overview are current. So if your systematic reviews are out of date, that means that your overview, by definition, will also be out of date. It's important to check that there are systematic reviews available for all major interventions or conditions of interest. And if there aren't, then this is a situation where you need to decide whether and how to proceed. So should you conduct your overview, recognizing that there might be a gap in your evidence base? Do you potentially have the resources to actually conduct the systematic review yourself prior to conducting the overview? All important considerations. And it also is important to make sure that it makes sense to include all of your interventions in the same overview. So this is referred to as the transitivity assumption, and essentially what this means is you want to ask yourself, could all of these different interventions reasonably be compared in different arms of a randomized controlled trial? If the answer to that question is no, then it might not make sense to include all of those same interventions in the same overview. So in terms of specifying the scope, as Lisa mentioned, it's important to pre-specify your populations, interventions, comparators, outcomes, and settings of interest. And one specific factor that's important to consider with overviews is you want to determine whether you want to include only Cochrane systematic reviews or whether you want to include systematic reviews published outside of the Cochrane Library as well. And this has important considerations because including these non-Cochrane systematic reviews can really increase the complexity of all of the stages of your overview. And that's because, like Denise mentioned, Cochrane really tries to avoid duplication of effort, so there will only be one systematic review on a specific topic. But if you're including non-Cochrane systematic reviews as well, there might be multiple systematic reviews on that same topic. So then you're faced with this issue of multiple systematic reviews that overlap in content. It's likely that some of those systematic reviews will include similar studies, and in an overview it's really important to only count each study's data one time because double counting data could introduce bias. So a question that you may want to ask yourself if you're considering an overview is, can the clinical question that I'm interested in be answered using only the evidence in the Cochrane systematic reviews, or should I go outside of these Cochrane reviews to address an important gap? In terms of searching, again, we're searching for systematic reviews and not for primary studies. If you're including Cochrane systematic reviews only, then you'll only need to search the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. If you're including non-Cochrane systematic reviews as well, then you'll want to determine which additional databases to search. Examples could be Medline or Embase. And you might also want to experiment with using validated systematic review filters, because this can help to restrict your search to systematic reviews only. If you're including only Cochrane systematic reviews, screening and inclusion will be very straightforward, because there will only be one systematic review per topic of interest, so you'll typically include all systematic reviews that meet your inclusion criteria. If you're including non-Cochrane systematic reviews, you might be faced with the issue of determining how to deal with multiple systematic reviews that overlap in content. So this will depend, the decision that you make on how to handle these overlapping reviews might depend on the scope and the purpose of your overview. But some questions to consider would be, do I want to include all systematic reviews regardless of topic overlap? Or do I want to limit myself to one systematic review per topic? And if you choose to limit to one systematic review per topic, then you need to determine which systematic review that will be. Will it be the most up-to-date? Will it be potentially the one with the highest methodological quality? Or the Cochrane review, if there is one? All important questions that should be thought through prior to beginning your overview. In terms of quality assessment, there are really two layers at the overview level. You need to assess the methodological quality of the systematic reviews that are included in your overview, and you can do this using, for example, the assessment of multiple systematic reviews, or AMSTAR tool, which has been around for several years and is quite commonly used. A newer tool that has been developed by individuals at the Cochrane collaboration is called the Risk of Bias in Systematic Reviews tool, so that's available as well. And this is especially important, again, if you're including non-Cochrane systematic reviews, because the quality of these systematic reviews is generally unknown. And as well as assessing the quality of the included systematic reviews, it's important to report the methodological quality of the studies that are found in the included systematic reviews. So you can do that by simply reporting the assessments made in the systematic reviews. The last thing that I want to talk about is outcome data extraction and presenting your results. So in the results section, you need to describe the characteristics of your included systematic reviews, as well as the primary studies included in those reviews. So you want to provide a description of the search strategies that were used in the systematic reviews, the objectives of the systematic reviews in terms of their PICO components, as well as the number of primary studies included in each systematic review and the study designs of those primary studies. In terms of outcome data extraction, this should really be driven by your well-defined clinical question and not by the data that's in the actual systematic reviews. So that goes back to the idea that it's very important to clearly specify your scope outright. And there are different ways that results can be extracted and presented in overviews, and this might depend on the purpose of the overview. So at the start, I presented two purposes of overviews. The first purpose is to present and describe the current body of systematic review evidence. If this is what you're trying to achieve with your overview, then it might make sense to map all systematic reviews in your clinical area and describe their characteristics. If your purpose, on the other hand, is to address a different clinical question than those that were asked in the included systematic reviews, your analysis might be more complicated. You might want to re-extract data from those systematic reviews, analyze them, perhaps using meta-analysis in a way that differed from the analyses conducted in the systematic reviews, and then present those reanalyzed data in your overview. So regardless of the method chosen to extract and present your results data, it's very important to be transparent when you're describing what you did and why you chose to do it. So a few lessons that we've learned over the years. We've been conducting overviews here since 2006, and perhaps the most important lesson that we've learned is to beware of the common assumption that overviews are easy and straightforward. There are individuals that may have the thought that all you're doing is compiling something that's already been done and that all the hard work has already been done for you. But the fact is that just because the unit of analysis is the systematic review, you're going to encounter unique challenges that are just simply not applicable when you're conducting, for example, a systematic review. On that line, we found that planning is very important. So I talked about checking those preconditions for conducting an overview and really clarifying the scope. And another point is that including non-Cochrane systematic reviews will increase the complexity of your overview at every stage of the overview process, but it can really increase the comprehensiveness of your overview as well, depending on the topic area. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought there. If you're interested in learning more about overviews, here are a few websites that you can visit. There's a chapter on overviews in the Cochrane Handbook. There's a webinar that has been published by the Child Health Field, which contains more information specifically about analyzing data in overviews. The link for the Cochrane Library has, we've talked about that earlier in the webinar as well, and if you want to see the overviews published in EBCH, that link is there for you also. So now I guess Lisa, Denise, and I will answer any questions that you have. You can type your questions into the chat box and then we'll determine the most appropriate person for that answer.
We can see that someone is in the process of typing, so we'll just wait to see if some questions come up.
And of course, several people can type at once, so do go ahead. So just while we wait, oh, here we go. Oh my goodness. So the first question is, do you know which provinces have purchased Cochrane subscriptions? And you know, as I was saying that, I realized I'm not up to date on which provinces have them. So I can check into that and get back to you. Because I'm not sure that I remember which provinces have them at the moment. Sorry. So the next question is, how does, so KT should be focused on evidence synthesized from multiple studies. And the question is, how does that fit in with granting agencies' approach for all original research to have a KT plan? That sounds like a good question for you.
She meant Lisa H. So yeah, that's a fantastic question. You know, I think what would be ideal is that, well, CIHR and other granting agencies are asking people to do systematic reviews prior to doing their primary research. I think what would be ideal is to have a systematic review to provide context for primary research, for people to conduct that, and then for them to update any systematic review or knowledge synthesis so that they're integrating their primary study back into the totality of the evidence. So that might be a novel way of somebody creating a KT plan for their primary research, is to propose that that they would you know, reanalyze a systematic review or whatever knowledge synthesis product, incorporating the results of their research prior to then passing it on for other knowledge translation strategies. The next question was, how would you recommend approaching a systematic review of an area where there has been very little research published? So another good question. I think, again, that's where I think a scoping review comes in handy in order to see whether, or the extent to which there has been research, whether it's published or unpublished. Because I think undertaking a systematic review is very resource intensive. There are systematic reviews published in the Cochrane Library that do not include any studies, and I guess some would argue that those are valuable in some ways in terms of highlighting that gap in evidence, whereas others would say, well, maybe you'd want to tweak your question or maybe broaden your question so that there is more substance there to your systematic review. I hope that I've answered some of those questions adequately, but feel free to, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, so yeah, there's no one typing, and we're just almost at the top of the hour. We're just managing our technology. Okay. There we go.
All right. So just as we end off, just want to let you know about the next couple of webinars coming up. We actually have ones planned in February and April as well. We just don't quite have the registration information yet. But these two in January and March 2016 are open for registration, and like today's webinar, available to anyone in the world free of charge. The January 20th one is on evaluating research impact, which will be presented by Dr. Anne Bergen, who's based in Ontario, and March 9th, a presentation by Dr. Denise Harrison on research to practice to research, her movement from which is be a background on her clinical work as a neonatal nurse and how that led her to conducting both trials and Cochrane reviews in the area of the treatment of neonatal pain. So you can register as indicated, and if you're not already signed up for our KT platform Communique, which is a newsletter we send out roughly every couple of weeks, you can sign up for that as well. This link will be in the slides sent out to you, and that's we use that to keep people informed of our workshops and webinars and other events that we're running. So it's a good way to stay in touch about our what we've got going. So on that note, thank you all for being involved today, for participating.